A cold morning in Dundee settled over the sorting office as Alexander Jack lifted a kettle onto the gas ring and waited for it to boil. Among the bundles of mail on his bench lay an envelope addressed to a small hairdressing salon on Kinloch Street. He eased a thin knife under the flap, held the seam over the rising steam until the gum softened and opened it without leaving a tear. Inside was a letter from New York, signed only Crown. The pages carried clumsy sketches of American coastal batteries and lines of text outlining a plan to seize a United States Army colonel. Jack laid each sheet under glass, photographed it for MI5, then slipped them back into the envelope and pressed the flap shut so the glue line looked untouched. Similar letters, always from the same source, had been passing through his hands at regular intervals for weeks. The salon on Kinloch Street belonged to Jessie Jordan, a Glasgow-born hairdresser who had spent many years in Germany before returning to Scotland in 1937. She had taken over the narrow shop, refurbished it, and hung out a sign reading Madame Jordan Hair Stylist. To her local customers it was just another modest business. To the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, it was a forwarding point. Reports from agents in the United States were routed by ship and post to Jordan's address, repackaged there, and sent on to contacts in Amsterdam and then to handlers in Hamburg. MI5 had placed the salon under mail watch after Jordan reused an old envelope that still carried her name on correspondence to an Abwehr address already known to British intelligence. That single, careless act linked an obscure Dundee shop to a wider German spy network. By early 1938, the content of the intercepted Crown letters became more precise and more dangerous. One described in detail a fictitious staff conference at the Hotel McAlpin in Manhattan. Colonel Henry Eglin of the United States Army would receive an official-looking invitation, attend the meeting, and be overpowered. The plan called for the theft of East Coast defense documents and for forged clues to be left behind, so that blame would fall on communists rather than on German agents. Jack opened that letter over his kettle on an ordinary working day, photographed the pages, and sent the film on its way through MI5 channels. Shortly afterwards, the text reached Washington through the British diplomatic bag. Senior officers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation read the warning and began searching for the unknown Agent Crown who had written it from New York. While American investigators moved, the Dundee channel stayed in use. MI5 wanted to protect the value of the source, and therefore held back one intercepted letter that named Crown's brother Gustav, a chemistry student in Prague, who was also offering his services to the Abwehr. The letters moving along Jack's routine route now formed a chain across the Atlantic, from an agent in New York, through a hairdresser's shop in Scotland, into the files of MI5 in London, and onto the FBI in the United States. What began as the quiet work of a postman steaming open envelopes on his ordinary round in Dundee was already exposing the outlines of a Nazi spy ring that linked Europe and the United States. A thin winter light lay over Dundee when Alexander Jack began his round at the General Post Office. He was a postman by title, but in the back room off the sorting floor his job had quietly changed. On a small table, beside the pigeonholes, stood a kettle, a sharp knife, and a boxy camera. Every morning he picked out envelopes addressed to a newly refurbished hairdressing shop at No. 1 Kinloch Street, the premises of a Glasgow-born stylist named Jessie Jordan, who had returned from Germany in 1937. Instead of sending those letters straight to the public counter, Jack carried them to the kettle. When the water boiled, he held each flap in the rising steam until the gum softened, slipped the knife along the seam, and eased the envelope open without tearing. Inside, again and again, he found letters from New York signed only with the name Crown and filled with notes on coastal guns, ship movements, and aircraft factories in the United States. He photographed every page, slid the originals back into place, pressed the flaps shut, and dropped the envelopes back into the ordinary mail. Jordan's shop had become part of the German Abwehr's mail system because of her long residence in Germany and her business life in Hamburg. British intelligence already knew her name from earlier reports. She had been sending crude sketches of British military sites to a post office box in Hamburg, and one reused envelope had exposed her identity. When she bought the Dundee salon in 1937 and began receiving foreign post there, MI5 did not at first connect the new address with the existing file. The decisive link came on a December day, when a shop assistant, Mary Curran, looked into Jordan's handbag, saw a secret map of Britain's East Coast defences, and realised that something was badly wrong. She told her husband, and the map was passed to the Dundee police and on to London. At MI5 headquarters in London, Officer Edward Hinchley Cook compared the name on the police report with his earlier Jordan file and ordered that every letter to and from the Kinloch Street salon be intercepted and copied with the help of the Dundee postal staff. What looked like a routine route for a local postman was now a live intelligence operation. From the copies that arrived in London, Hinchley Cook watched the pattern of letters from Crown emerge. The writer's hand was untidy, his information often of poor quality, but the persistence of the correspondence and the obvious interest in American military matters made him a concern. Before his arrest, Crown was known in German and American records as Guenther Gustav Maria Rumrich, a Chicago-born former United States Army sergeant who had deserted in the mid-1930s and then volunteered his services to the Abwehr. From New York, he sent reports on coastal defenses and other topics, routing his letters through Jordan's address so that they could be forwarded on to contacts in Amsterdam and then to Hamburg. One of these messages stood out. It described plans for a fictitious staff conference at the Hotel McAlpin in Manhattan, where a United States Army Colonel Henry Eglin would attend a meeting carrying East Coast defense plans. The text set out a scheme to lure him to the hotel, overpower him, seize the documents, and leave planted clues that would point investigators toward communist suspects rather than German agents. When Jack steamed that letter open and Cook saw the film of its pages, MI5 passed the warning and the images to the British Embassy in Washington, which in turn alerted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In New York, the Bureau began hunting for the unknown Crown described in the British message. Within weeks, agents arrested Rumrich after he impersonated Secretary of State Cordell Hull in an attempt to obtain blank United States passports, and they found that the wording of the kidnap plot in his possession matched the text MI5 had already photographed in Dundee. Questioned by FBI investigator Leon G. Turu, Rumrich admitted his role as an Abwehr agent and identified his associates, including SS Europa hairdresser Johanna Hoffmann, Mitchell field soldier Enrich Glaser, airplane mechanic Otto Voss, and German-American doctor Ignaz Theodor Griebel. The case led to the indictment of 18 people in 1,938 inches, what became known as the Rumrich spy case, the first major pre-war international espionage case for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Behind its headlines lay the quieter work on Kinloch Street and in the Dundee sorting office. Without the decision to place Jordan's shop under a mail watch, without Mary Curran's discovery of the defence map, and without Alexander Jack's careful steaming opening and resealing of envelopes on his daily route, the Crown letters might never have been connected to a broader transatlantic ring. The routine steps of a single postman had helped to expose a Nazi spy network linking Europe and the United States. Guenther Gustav Maria Rumrich telephoned the passport office of the United States State Department on the 14th day of February, 1938. Posing as Secretary of State Cordell Hull, he demanded that 35 blank passports be prepared at once and delivered to a messenger in New York. The clerk who took the call found the request implausible, checked Hull's whereabouts and confirmed that the real secretary was in Washington. The incident was reported up the chain and passed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A controlled delivery was arranged. When Rumrich appeared to collect the package, investigators were waiting. He was arrested without resistance. Among the papers taken from him were notes describing a plan to lure a United States Army colonel to a hotel in Manhattan and seize East Coast defense plans. A scheme that matched a kidnap letter British officers had already seen in copies of Crown's correspondence intercepted in Dundee. FBI Special Agent Leon G. Turu began questioning that night. Rumrich talked at length. He explained that under the cover name Crown, he had been sending reports to a Scottish contact, Jessie Jordan, whose Dundee hairdressing salon served as a forwarding address for the German Abwehr. He gave the names of others in the ring. He identified an intermediary on the liner SS Europa hairdresser Johanna Hoffmann, who carried messages and money across the Atlantic. He described soldier Erich Glaser at Mitchell Field on Long Island airplane mechanic Otto Voss and the German-American doctor Ignaz Theodor Griebel, who had recruited him and then returned to Europe. He claimed contacts in the Panama Canal zone and drew sketches of coast artillery positions. Some of his information checked out. Much of it proved exaggerated or wrong when investigators compared it with independent reports. Under sustained interrogation, Rumrich admitted that the Dundee address belonged to Jordan and confirmed that he had mailed his crown letters there from New York. He acknowledged that he had written about recruiting his brother Gustav in Prague to join German intelligence work in Central Europe. The picture that emerged for the FBI was of a scattered but real Abwehr network that linked agents and sources in Germany, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands, Scotland, and the United States. What had begun with a British mail watch on one small salon in Dundee, and with a postman's routine steaming open of envelopes on his daily round, now ended with handcuffs in New York and a public spy case that exposed Nazi Germany's secret ring connecting Europe and the United States. Publicity from the Rumrich case in the American press made it clear that Jessie Jordan's address in Dundee could no longer be treated as a secure postbox. My5 no longer needed to shield the full contents of the Crown Channel. Edward Hinchley Cook therefore passed on the intercepted letter from Gwenther Rumrich's brother Gustav in Prague, which British officers had previously held back to protect their source. Through the British intelligence station in Prague, the Czechoslovak authorities were warned that a chemistry student in their capital was offering his services to the Abwehr. On the 3rd day of March, 1,938 Czech police arrested Gustav Rumrich in Prague. Under interrogation, he admitted that he had been given 2 Abwehr contact addresses, one for Mrs. Jessie Jordan in Scotland and the other for Mrs. Gertrude Brandy in Booterstown near Dublin. Because the Irish Free State lay outside British jurisdiction, MI5 could not move directly against Brandy. Instead, Hinchley Cook arranged for letters addressed to her in Dublin to be intercepted while they passed through British sorting offices on their way to Ireland. The new mail watch soon produced results. Among the material copied was a postcard from Tahiti in French Polynesia, sent by an Abwehr source who signed himself Charles and used the established euphemism of stamp collections to describe secret intelligence he intended to send on his return. Later, a letter postmarked in Paris and intercepted on its way to Mrs. Brandy was found to contain 4 closely written sheets outlining the dispositions of the French Mediterranean fleet and the latest French naval ciphers. For the first time, British officers could see that the Jordan and Brandy route was carrying information of real strategic value to Germany. Hinchley Cook recognized the danger at once. If German naval officers could read French signals, then in any future war the combined operations of the French and Royal Navy in the Mediterranean would be at risk. In June 1938, he travelled to Paris with MI6 officer Wilfred Dunderdale to brief the Deuxième Bureau. Together they handed over copies of the intercepted letter and explained how it had been obtained through the Jordan and Brandy mail channels. French intelligence officers began combing leave records and handwriting samples from the Mediterranean fleet until they identified the traitor as Ancien Marc Aubert of the destroyer Vauquelin. His arrest and execution later that year removed Agent Charles from the Abwehr network. Meanwhile, in Dundee, public reports of the Nazi spy trial in New York convinced MI5 that Jordan herself could not be left at liberty. On the morning of the 2nd day of March, 1,938 Police Constable Annie Ross entered the Kinloch Street salon, posing as a customer to confirm that the hairdresser was on the premises. Once she had stepped outside and given the signal, a police car drew up, and Edward Hinchley Cook entered the shop with local officers. Jessie Jordan was arrested, and her premises searched. The mail watch that had begun with Scottish postal workers quietly steaming open envelopes on their daily rounds had now led to arrests in Dundee, Prague and New York, and through the Brandy Channel to the unmasking of a French naval officer, spying for Germany. The Abwehr's transatlantic ring, linking Europe and the United States, had been stripped of some of its most important links. French officers needed a way to turn the intercepted clues about Agent Charles into a living suspect. One of the letters, copied from the Brandy Channel, mentioned a meeting with his German handler in Antwerp on a particular weekend. Belgian police were asked to help. They collected every hotel registration card for those dates and sent the bundles to Paris. In the offices of the Deuxième Bureau, clerks sifted through the cards and narrowed their attention to naval names. One entry stood out: Marc Aubert Hotel Century Antwerp. When French naval authorities checked their lists, they could not find any serving officer of that name who should have been in the city. The search took months. Investigators requested handwriting samples from officers in the Mediterranean fleet and compared them with the script taken from letters signed Charles. At last, they found an exact match. The traitor was an ensign de vaisseau named Marc Aubert, a recent graduate of the École Navale serving on the destroyer Vauquelin at Toulon. Under orders from Paris, he was placed under close surveillance. French counterintelligence let him continue his duties, but restricted his contacts, watching to see whether he attempted to pass further information to his German handlers. In early November 1938, 2 officers from the French Secret Service entered Aubert's cabin on the Vauquelin and caught him in the act of copying out another naval cipher for transmission to Germany. He was arrested on the spot and taken ashore for questioning. A military court in Toulon tried him in camera in January 1939. Under the tightened treason laws which now allowed the death penalty in peacetime, he was condemned to be shot. On 6 March 1939, at a ditch near Fort Malbousquet, outside the naval dockyard at Toulon-Aubert, was tied to a stake and executed by firing squad. For the French Navy, the removal of Agent Charles closed a dangerous breach in their security. For British intelligence, the case confirmed how far the Jordan and Brandy mail channels had reached. The chain that had begun with letters intercepted over a steaming kettle in a Dundee sorting room now ran through Antwerp hotels and Mediterranean warships to a firing squad in southern France, stripping away yet another link in Nazi Germany's spy ring between Europe and the United States. 18 people were named in the New York espionage indictment. Only 4 were ultimately convicted and sentenced in 1938. Johanna Hoffmann stood first and received 4 years in prison. Erich Glaser followed with a sentence of 2 years. Otto Hermann Voss drew 6 years for passing information on aircraft construction. Guenther Gustav Maria Rumrich, whose confession had opened the case, accepted a sentence of 2 years in return for cooperation as a witness. Their recruiter, Dr. Ignaz Theodor Griebel, did not appear in court. He had been questioned with a polygraph in May 1938. Within days, he left New York aboard the German liner Bremen, sailing for Germany before he could be brought to trial in the espionage case. In Edinburgh, Jessie Jordan heard her verdict in 1939, 4 years imprisonment for espionage. She served part of her sentence in Scottish prisons and was then interned as an enemy alien for the remainder of the war. After 1945, she was deported to Germany and settled in Hamburg, where she died in 1954. The hairdressing salon in Dundee never again served as an Abwehr postbox. The mail watch that had begun with a postman steaming open suspicious envelopes linked investigations on both sides of the Atlantic, from New York to Scotland, Ireland, Czechoslovakia, the Netherlands and France. What started as a single routine route exposed a German intelligence network connecting Nazi Germany with agents in Europe and the United States, and ended with broken channels, public trials, and a clear warning that transatlantic espionage would not go unnoticed. Leon G. Theroux left the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1938 after clashing with his superiors over his handling of the Nazi spy case. He then sold a series of articles about the investigation to the New York Post and expanded them into a book, Nazi Spies in America, published in New York in 1939. Warner Bros. Purchased the screen rights to his account and hired Anatole Litvak to direct a feature film with Edward G. Robinson in the lead as an FBI agent. Confessions of a Nazi Spy opened in the spring of 1939 as the first explicitly anti-Nazi feature released by a major Hollywood studio. Audiences saw recreated hotel rooms, Nazi rallies and passport forgeries drawn from events that had taken place only months before. Historians later measured the reach of the affair. The chain that began with steam over a kettle in a Dundee sorting room ran through 18 people indicted in the United States, 1 French naval officer executed for treason, 1 Scottish hairdresser convicted of espionage and other suspects detained or watched across Europe. Press coverage in 1938 treated it as a major Nazi spy ring broken on American soil, but intelligence files preserved a colder picture. Many of the agents were amateurs. They wrote in plain ink, reused envelopes, and trusted hairdressers and ship's stewards instead of secure tradecraft. Postal clerks and examiners with kettles and patience defeated them. Inside government, the case worked as an early warning. In the United States, it helped to persuade policymakers, including President Franklin Roosevelt, that organized Nazi espionage already operated on American territory and that stronger counter-espionage provisions and better internal security were needed. In Britain, the Jordan investigation entered MI5's growing registry as an example of German intelligence using civilian cover and postal routes to move information. For both services, routine letters and small-town addresses no longer looked harmless. One letter every 4 days, from New York to a hairdresser's shop in Dundee, had helped produce 4 convictions in a Manhattan courtroom, the unmasking and execution of a French naval spy, and a large-scale view of Abwehr activity across the Atlantic that American and British officers could study together. A postman in Dundee closed his knife, set the kettle aside, and walked back to his round. The particular ring he had helped expose was finished.